One of the great takeaways from this book is that God's creation is so cool. Welcome. I'm Derek Gilbert in the Skywatch TV studios with author Josh Peck as we're talking about his book, Quantum Creation. We have just touched on this a little bit between this and your book, Cherubim Chariots, about multidimensional theory and the idea that there are more dimensions than the three that we can perceive. What is the fourth dimension and how can we possibly perceive it?
Sure. Well, fourth dimension really depends on the interpretation that the person is putting on it. It's a personal definition. Some will say that the fourth dimension is time. That's absolutely correct. Some will say that the fourth dimension is a higher dimension of space. Also absolutely correct. The one I mainly deal with in the book, I do talk about time, but I mainly deal with the fourth spatial dimension, or the fourth one of space.
Okay.
And it's basically, we live in three dimensions that are defined by the X, Y, and Z axis, if we remember from middle school geometry.
Height, length, width, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of a fourth spatial dimension is two perpendicular directions outside from that. Every time you have a new dimension, you have two perpendicular directions. So if we start with the X, we have two perpendicular directions to give us the Y, and then Z after that. Based on our perception, we can't go higher than that.
Right.
But there seems to be at least a fourth, but even as many as 11 or 12 higher dimensions in total. Now, I say 12 because modern M theory states that there are 10 dimensions of space and one of time, giving 11 in total. I talk a little bit about a possible type of 12th dimension called, it would actually be the 0th dimension. If we think of a dimension, the first dimension, as a line between 2 points, the 0th dimension would be the first point.
Just a point.
Just a point by itself. So I don't know if that really constitutes as a dimension, but it's something. So if there are 12, that has all sorts of biblical importance around that number, divine government, things like that. So I talk a lot about that in the book. As far as how to visualize it, our perception, we just can't. But we do have examples that we can look at. The best example I've ever heard is a literary example that almost every physicist that I've ever read uses, and it's based on a book called Flatland.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and it basically talks about a hypothetical dimension, just two-dimensional land, flatland, so they don't have the z-axis at all. And what the book explores is how would a three-dimensional person like you or I, how would we explain ourselves to a two-dimensional flatlander? So it goes through various things. Like if you stuck your finger through flatland, all they would see is a point appear out of nowhere as your finger goes through, and it would grow into a circle. Now we can apply that to how a fourth dimensional object would look to us if it passed through. We would see a point in space, and it would appear as a sphere, if we're talking about a hypersphere. And as it left, it would shrink and disappear. And isn't it interesting that a lot of reports of UFO phenomena report that very thing? And I believe we talked about that in an earlier program. So that's one example of how we can try to visualize what a fourth dimensional object would look like. We can also unfold it. And we talked about that, extra dimensional unfolding in a previous program too. So if we take a hypercube, which is a four-dimensional cube, unfold it into our dimension, it would, it's called a tesseract. It would basically look like a cross with two extra arms, all cubes. So that's another way that we could try to visualize
But
that.
what evidence do scientists have that there are these additional dimensions?
Well, they have they're able to look at certain particles that seem to disappear and reappear. Sometimes they're in more than one space or more than one place at one time. And we even have something called quantum entanglement, which is the travel of information at faster than light speeds, which should be impossible.
Right.
But the only way that it's possible is if you add extra dimensions, if they're operating in extra dimensions.
And quantum entanglement basically says that when you change the state of a particle here, that its entangled particle, its partner particle, which could be anywhere in the universe, also changes state at the same moment.
Immediately, yeah, absolutely. It doesn't. There's no amount of time that it takes. It's just immediate, which should be impossible.
Yeah. Wow. Well, like I said, this creation of God's is a lot cooler than I ever thought when I was sitting in science class. In fact, I thought that was the fourth dimension there, was sitting in science class, because it took that last 15 minutes and made it an hour and a half long.
Oh, yeah.
The book, Quantum Creation, the author is Josh Peck. He'll be a guest on an upcoming episode of Skywatch TV, so make sure you keep watching. I'm Derek Gilbert.